Hey, it's great to have all of you here with us today, and we're excited to introduce our next speaker today, Tyler Shultz. Probably the best way to introduce Tyler is to remind you of what you probably already know about Theranos, one of the high-flying companies early in the last decade to have then flamed out, amazingly so. But what you may not have heard is the inside story from someone who came in right at a pivotal time in Theranos history, and that's where Tyler comes in. Right out of college, joining Theranos and being able to see it in its excitement, and also recognizing some things that threw him off just a little bit. So probably the best way to start our introduction and have Tyler jump right in is to have you, Tyler, why don't you tell us about the first time you met Elizabeth Holmes?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the introduction. Happy to be here. And the first time I met Elizabeth Holmes was actually in my grandfather's living room on Stanford campus. So my grandfather worked and lived on Stanford campus. I was a junior at the university at the time. And I got a call from him just saying that he was having a brilliant woman over to have a conversation, and he thought I would learn a lot by listening. And so I said, sure. And I hopped on my bike. I biked over to his house. And I went to his living room where I first met and saw Elizabeth. You know, she was wearing her usual all black turtleneck, dressing like Steve Jobs. And it was my grandfather, me, Elizabeth, and Dianne Feinstein, a senator from California, was also there. And that was the first time that I heard Elizabeth lay out the vision that I would later hear her probably tell dozens and dozens of times, which was being able to do anything that could be done in a central laboratory from a single drop of blood. And even better than that, you could do it pretty much anywhere where you had electricity. So you could do this in a helicopter, in a battlefield, in a Walgreens, in an operating room, in a patient's home. It really just seemed like this technology had no limits. And in that first interaction, I knew that it was something that I had to be a part of. And I ended up going and doing a 3-month internship there between my junior and senior year of college. So I went and did the internship, and there were almost no red flags. So I was mostly working in a research lab, which never interacted with the actual Theranos product. And even my manager and senior scientists who I was working with, who had been there for years, had never actually seen the actual Theranos product. And so in retrospect, that was a red flag. But at the time, I don't know, it didn't seem that abnormal to me because Theranos was extremely secretive. They had been in stealth mode for, I think, over a decade. So it kind of made sense that they would try to keep those secrets as tightly held as possible. But I remember on my last day of my internship, I told someone that I hoped I would come back for a full-time job. And that scientist, who actually was working with the Theranos device, said, you shouldn't do that. You should get a job somewhere else and learn how to do real science. And I was very taken aback by that comment, but it was just so different than the experience that I had as an intern that I ignored it. So I came back as a full-time employee about a year later after I graduated from school. And my first day was actually the day that they launched the product. So it was the first time that they came out of stealth mode. Elizabeth did the ribbon cutting ceremony at the first Walgreens center or wellness center in Walgreens in Palo Alto. So it was a big day in the company. But also on that same day, the manager of the assay validation team quit in a very dramatic way. Someone came by, a group of scientists I was with, and said that she was in the parking lot crying. So if you wanted to say goodbye, you had to go out now. And that was kind of confusing to me as well. And she was in charge of the team that was that made sure that the tests were safe before they were used on real patients. So they would take a test and run it through a series of tests to characterize it and make sure that it was working properly before you used it on a real patient. So the manager of that lab quit. And then the manager of my lab pulled our team aside and said that even though we had quote unquote launched the product, that none of the tests were actually being run on the Theranos device. So we were collecting samples at Walgreens. Phlebotomists would drive them back to Theranos, and then we would either run them on third-party equipment or we would send them out to other labs to get the results back. So it was a really confusing first day.
Yeah, this is first day.
Yeah, that's my first day as a full-time employee. All this is happening. It's like half of the company is riding high because we launched the product. The other half of the company feels like it's falling apart already. You have managers who are quitting. We know that the product isn't actually being used. So it's really confusing. And by the end of that week, we got an email from the COO president of the company, Sunny Balwani, saying that we should stop all of our experiments because all of the research teams were being moved into assay validation. And my understanding of what was happening was that team was working literally around the clock trying to get these assays validated or online. And they were essentially being treated like pieces of machinery. So people were quitting. And I was told that at one point that team was around 30 people. And by the time we launched this product, it had shrunk down to about 8. So they just shut down all the research teams and put us all into assay validation. And that's when I actually got to start working with the Theranos device myself. And right off the bat, you can tell that something is amiss because as part of our onboarding, we went and saw what was called the open reader. So this was one of the devices that didn't have the plastic shell on it. So you could see exactly what was inside and you could see what it was doing. And I remember the manager from my research lab was getting that demonstration the first time that I was. And I remember watching it, and Aruna turned to the woman who was giving us the demo and just said, "Do you think this is cool?" And the woman kind of shrugged her shoulders and said, "I'll let you decide for yourself," and walked away. What we saw was just a pipette on a robotic arm. And a pipette is just the most common piece of lab equipment. You can find it in most high school labs. Actually,
I remember you in your book, you described how even you would have to tape the door closed on the device just to keep the temperature a little more steady. And
yeah. So on top of that, it was poorly engineered. So yeah, sometimes the door wouldn't shut afterwards. So we'd physically tape it shut. The barcode scanners inside sometimes wouldn't work. So we'd take the barcodes off of the cartridges, put them on scissors and stick the scissors in and wiggle them around until the barcode scanned. Sometimes the tips would fall off of the pipette and then they would get stuck in the gears and jam the gears. There were all kinds of engineering problems with it. And so I guess it's not that surprising that when I started running experiments with this product, that the results were just not very good. Mm-hmm. And that was the most concerning thing to me was, even if it had worked well, it would not have lived up to the hype, but it didn't even work. And that was a huge problem because we were starting to run real patients on a product that did not work. And my job was to calculate how much variation there was in a result. So I would run the same sample, I think 60 times, and then we would calculate how much variation there was. And on our website, we advertised that our coefficient of variations were less than 10%. And the lower the better for coefficient of variation. And when I was actually running the experiments to calculate that, I almost never saw anything less than 20. We were more in like the 20 to 40 kind of range, not 10. Mm-hmm. And then there was a time when we had to get our certification to actually be a central laboratory. So that's managed or regulated by a group called CLIA. And so when the CLIA inspectors came to inspect our lab, we were told not to go in or out of the lab that had the Theranos product. So those inspectors came and gave the certification to Theranos without ever seeing the Theranos product. So that was a big red flag to me. And then we participated in something called proficiency testing, which is essentially like an audit where a third party sends a sample, you test it the same way you would test a patient sample, send the result back, and then they see who got the right result. And when we got it, we split the sample and ran it on third-party equipment and the Theranos product. And in some cases, the results were off by more than 300%. And we decided to report the results from the third-party equipment, even though at that time, we were running the patient samples on the Theranos device. So it seemed like when we were being watched, management could make the decision and say, okay, we should report third-party equipment. But when a normal patient came in and we weren't being audited, we weren't being watched by regulators, we were just fine giving incorrect results to the patient. There were also instances where quality controls failed, which is an indicator that the test is not working. And then Sunny would pressure technicians to run samples anyway. So essentially, we know the test isn't going to work, but we're going to test patients anyway and knowingly give them incorrect results. So the red flags were just piling on. And for me, it came to a head with a test for syphilis that I had worked on the validation for. And I calculated the coefficient of variation to be 43%, which was very high. And then we tested samples that were known to be positive for syphilis, and we only got 65% correct, which is not very good. So we essentially pretended like that didn't happen, and we tried again. And the second time we got 80% correct. And then we did a finger stick versus venous study to make sure that samples from the finger are the same as samples from the arm. And for that, we collect samples from ourselves and from our colleagues. And a huge percentage of Theranos employees tested positive for syphilis. And miraculously, it passed validation. The medical director gave a stamp of approval saying, okay, we're ready to start running real patient samples, testing them for syphilis. And that was really broke my back. And I thought that I had very clear evidence that the test did not work, but that we had decided to run the test anyway. So I reached out to Elizabeth and brought some of my concerns to her. And I was pretty much brushed aside. And so I tried to set up follow-up meetings with her, and she started ignoring me. And eventually she just said, just write all your concerns in an email and then I'll address them. So I wrote her a very long email where I essentially said, this is a problem that I see. Here's data to support that problem or observation. And here's what I think we should do about it. And I did that for point after point after point, sent her this email. And she didn't respond, but Sunny did. And he essentially said in an even longer email in all red, a lot of it all caps and bolded, he essentially said that I was arrogant, ignorant, patronizing, reckless. I had no understanding of basic math, science, or statistics. And that if I had any other last name, that I would have already been held accountable in the strongest way. And I kind of forgot to mention the point that around the time that I joined full time, my grandfather joined the board of Theranos. Okay. So he was essentially saying he was doing me a favor by not firing me or whatever holding accountable to the strongest extent would entail.
So I got to get this straight. So you're barely started. This is still your first year, right? Your first few months.
Yeah. I worked there in total for 8 months.
And so how do you get the courage and even the confidence to keep going in the face of someone saying, you don't even know what you're talking about? You're still new.
Yeah, that's a good question. So part of it is when I look back on the story, I think a lot of the things that Sunny accused me of actually did turn out to be true. I think I was arrogant. I was ignorant. I was reckless, but I'm super lucky because I was also right. But essentially everyone was afraid to speak up because we had seen instances in the past where someone would raise concerns and they were fired and nothing changed. So no one benefits from that at all. There was another time when Elizabeth sued a group of former employees. And when she did that, she actually sent out a company-wide email essentially saying, we're not afraid to sue you. Like all those NDAs you signed, those are not empty. We will absolutely sue you to protect Theranos. So people were afraid, and they had a lot of money. They had a very powerful board that had secretaries of state, secretary of defense. So people were essentially bullied into silence, and that just for some reason didn't work on me. Right when I walked out the door, my mom called me and said, stop whatever you're about to do. And I said, I already quit, so it's too late. They're not going to let me back in. And she said, no, that's not what I'm talking about. She said, Elizabeth called your grandfather and told him that you vocalized a vendetta against her, and that if you executed that vendetta, that you would lose. And I had no idea what she was talking about. So I went and met up with my grandfather to straighten this all out. And he said that Elizabeth told him that I had quit in a very dramatic and inappropriate way, and that she had been trying to meet with me to calm me down, but that I was refusing to meet with her, which was so far from the truth, because for weeks I had been trying to schedule a meeting with her and she was completely ignoring me. So I left Theranos. I went and I worked in a lab at Stanford for a little bit. And then my former manager from Theranos, Aruna, had also quit and started building a team at Roche. And so she recruited me to her team at Roche. So I was working there. While I was working at Roche, I had a Thanksgiving dinner with Elizabeth because she was becoming almost like part of our family at that point. She was coming to Christmases and Thanksgivings and birthday parties. She was almost like my cousin. So I went to Thanksgiving, where the guest list was just me, my parents, Elizabeth, her parents, and my grandparents. That was everybody. It was super intimate and super awkward. And then in one of my meetings at Roche, Aruna turned her computer to me and said, look, there's an investigative journalist who asked me a question about Theranos. So I went back to my desk and I pulled up his LinkedIn page. And it turns out he saw that I looked at his LinkedIn page and then sent me a message on LinkedIn asking if I'd be willing to talk to him. So I ignored him for about a month, but eventually I got curious. So I went and I bought a burner phone with cash and I called him just to see what he knew, what the angle was. And turned out he knew a ton. And he had a source who was way above me, one of the medical directors, I think. And so he was really looking for corroborating sources. And I told him about this email exchange that I had, and I could practically hear him salivate over the phone wanting to get his hands on that email. But essentially in that call, I agreed to work with him as a background source. And I said, my grandfather was part of the Nixon administration during Watergate. He was part of the Reagan administration during the Iran-Contra scandal. And he made it out of both of those with his integrity completely intact. So there's no doubt in my mind that if the truth about Theranos is exposed, that he's going to work to make things right with the people she's hurt, and he will come out of this with his integrity intact. So that was part of my motivation for becoming a source for the Wall Street Journal. Unfortunately, that's not really how it panned out. So shortly after I spoke to the Wall Street Journal, I went home to have dinner with my parents, and my dad had just gotten off the phone with my grandfather and he said, have you been speaking to a Wall Street Journal reporter? And I said, yes. And my dad was furious at me because we had talked about this before and he told me that I shouldn't talk to him. And I said, don't worry, they don't actually know. This reporter has won a Pulitzer Prize. He's not just going to go give away the names of his sources to Theranos. So I went and I called my grandfather, and he said that Elizabeth told him that I was giving away trade secrets, and in order to protect those trade secrets, they needed me to sign a one-page non-disclosure agreement saying that I wouldn't disclose anything moving forward. And I said, I don't know why I have to sign that, but sure, I'm happy to meet with the lawyers tomorrow morning. But before then, can I just come over and talk to you, my grandfather, without any lawyers around? And he said, sure, no problem. So I went over to his house, and well, actually, I briefly went back to the apartment that I was renting with some friends, and I walked in and I was panicked and I told them what was going on. And my friend said, okay, well, when you go over to see your grandfather, you're going to tell him the truth. And I said, yeah, I'm going to tell him the truth because I've always told the truth. I just want to keep telling the truth. And he said, dude, you should definitely lie. This is one of those cases where you don't know what's at stake. You can always decide to tell the truth if you want to, but once you do, you can't go back. So you should probably lie. So I quickly called John Carreyrou, and he ended up sending me, the reporter, and he ended up sending me all of the correspondences that he had with Theranos. And one piece of his email said that your coefficient of variation is as high as 42.9%, which was a number that I calculated that was in that email. So I knew that that was the exact reason why they knew that I was the one of the sources. But I also figured that I could comfortably say that it wasn't me until I learned what was at stake. So I went over to my grandfather's house. I reiterate all my old points. He reiterates all of his old points. And he says that Elizabeth told him that the reporter used complete sentences out of an email that I sent to her, which I knew was not true. And I just said I had no idea how that could be possible because I hadn't spoken to the reporter. And he said, okay, whatever the case may be, will you meet with the Theranos lawyers? And I said, sure. And he said, well, there's actually 2 lawyers here right now. Can I go get them? And that completely took me by surprise. But I said, yeah, sure, go get them. So these 2 lawyers come down, and they do not bring a 1-page non-disclosure agreement. They give me a notice to appear in court on Friday morning, and this was a Wednesday night. They gave me an application for a temporary restraining order, and they gave me a strongly worded letter signed by someone named David Boyce, who I'd never heard of. And we end up kind of butting heads for a little bit, and eventually my grandfather kicks them out of the house. And we end up calling Elizabeth right after that. And he said, we were trying to have a conversation. You sent over a litigator. Tomorrow, I want you to send different lawyers to the house, and I want you to send the 1-page non-disclosure agreement that we had discussed. So I go back the next day, and of course, the same 2 lawyers show up, and of course, it's not a non-disclosure agreement. They give me an affidavit that essentially says, my name is Tyler Shultz, I'm 24 years old. I have not spoken to the Wall Street Journal, but here's a list of names of people who I know have. And at the bottom, it says, under penalty of perjury, Tyler Shultz. So I know I don't want to sign this because I don't want to commit perjury. So I say I'm not gonna list names of people who I think have spoken to the Wall Street Journal. And the lawyers are adamant that they need that information from me. And things start to get heated again. So my grandfather puts the lawyers in the living room, and I'm in the dining room, and he's going between the 2 rooms because it's like the lawyers and we can't have a conversation in the same room because things have deteriorated. But eventually the lawyers take out the part about listing names. So my grandfather comes back and says, guess what? You got everything you wanted. And I said, well, as far as I can tell, I can sign this, and I have a notice to appear in court tomorrow that doesn't go away. So I need there to be a clause that says they won't sue me. So in pencil, he wrote, Theranos will not sue Tyler for 2 years. And I said, 2 years?
2 years?
Yeah, 2 years. This was in 2015, by the way. So 2 years was already a long time ago. And I said, that wouldn't work for me. So we crossed out 2 years and wrote forever and brought it to the Theranos lawyers. And I was shocked that they agreed. And essentially, I interpreted that as them calling my bluff. And it felt like every single person in the room knew that I was lying, knew that I was about to commit perjury. And it felt like if I had signed that, it would have just made their days. They would have been so happy if I committed perjury right then. But instead, I ended up just saying, Elizabeth has had a lawyer look at this with her best interest in mind. So now I want to have a lawyer look at this with my best interest in mind. And my grandfather looked really annoyed when I said that, but he said, okay, and he asked if his personal attorney said it was fine for me to sign, would I then sign it? And I said, yeah, sure. So he went to go fax this to his attorney, and I went into his kitchen and started flipping through his contacts book, trying to find the lawyer's phone number. But luckily my step grandmother came in and slapped a piece of paper in my hand with a phone number written on it. And she said, go call him. So I went outside, I called the lawyer. I said, my grandfather's about to send you something. He's going to tell you to tell me that I have to sign it, but you have to tell him that I cannot sign it. And he was just kind of like, whoa, okay. Slow down a little bit. And he said, okay, well, who's representing them? And I said, someone named David Boyce. And he just went, holy, do you know who that is? And he then listed all the high profile cases that he's been involved with. He's considered the #1 corporate gun in America. He's since been Harvey Weinstein's lawyer. And he's not someone you want on your bad side. Anyway, I went up and I met with that lawyer, and I went to bed that night with a notice to appear in court the following morning. Luckily, I woke up to an email from the Theranos lawyers saying that they would give me more time to negotiate. And that started this cycle where they would give me a court date. We would negotiate, argue. The court date would pass. They would give me another court date. And it was just this cycle where it felt like for months, within the next 3 days, I was going to be in a courtroom. And it was extremely expensive, extremely stressful, extremely lonely and isolating. But eventually the Wall Street finally publishes their story in October 2015. And then they kind of let some of the pressure off of me. And since after that, it was a very slow unraveling. They finally shut their doors in 2018. The SEC said that Elizabeth was guilty of a years-long massive fraud. My grandfather eventually left the board of directors about more than a year after the first articles came out, after I ended up going on the record with my story. And now she's awaiting her March court date.
Yeah, she was just, I mean, she's probably in the news more often than I realized, but I just noticed today she was in the news requesting that, that no one mention her wealth and luxurious lifestyle in the court proceedings because it's irrelevant. It's like, wow, okay. So
that's certainly not irrelevant.
Yeah. Well, the audience today, we have a lot of directors and officers, so on boards as well as, executives for companies. And, what would you say to them as they look at this, from the outside and think, oh my goodness, this could happen in my company. What do I do to make sure I'm being aware of these kind of circumstances? What would you tell them?
Yeah, well, I mean, clearly the board of directors at Theranos, I would say we're negligent at best. And to me, it seemed like she had just put together a group of older men who just fawned over her and who treated her more like a daughter than they did a CEO. At Elizabeth's 30th birthday party, I listened to Henry Kissinger read a limerick that he wrote for Elizabeth, where the punchline was, "You're not the next Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs was an earlier you." And that's I just can't imagine Steve Jobs board members treating him like that, where it seemed like they were just vying for her attention and affection. They did not ask tough questions of her. I brought a lot of information to my grandfather, who, as far as I know, did absolutely nothing with it. He just had a conversation with Elizabeth and that eased his mind, but he didn't conduct any type of internal investigation. The board never reached out to lower level employees or managers of these teams to see what was actually going on. They completely lacked the expertise that was needed in the field to actually understand what the product was. After I left Theranos, I started working in this lab at Stanford, and then I worked at Roche. And then I went back to the lab at Stanford, where I was working with a professor in diagnostics, where he had spent years repurposing old computer hard drive technology, so magnets that flip up and down to store zeros and ones for binary, repurposing those to do diagnostics. And it's really, it's sensitive, it's quantitative. They're really small sensors, so you can put a lot of them in a little area, so it's multiplexable. It's portable. It kind of, it's funny because I left Theranos and I thought, man, if there's actually a technology that could do this, it could be huge. And then I think I found that technology at Stanford. And so I ended up spinning out a little startup with that professor, trying to commercialize these biosensors and getting them out into the real world. Elizabeth sold me so well on this vision of changing the way diagnostics is done that I'm still chasing that vision today. And I'm just going about it in a completely different way.
So let me point people in the audience to the book that you just released. This is, I think it's an Audible original, Thicker Than Water.
Yeah, it's a straight to audio book.
Yeah, and it's a great, if you want to know more details about this story, check it out. It's great. I enjoyed it a lot. Tyler, thanks so much for joining us today. It's great to hear from you.
Happy to be here.